Hello and welcome to our viewers in the United States and Europe. I'm Katja Donovan, Executive Director of 1014, and it is my great pleasure to welcome you to the first event in our new virtual series, which is held in cooperation with the American Council on Germany. This series is called Hot Topics Called Realities, and in it, we plan to explore the issues that are dominating the political debate in Germany and in the United States. We want to unpack today's hot topics with German and American guests who are experts on the topic and put them under the microscope to parse out the cold realities.
And I'm Steve Sokol, the president of the American Council on Germany, and we're absolutely delighted to be partnering with 1014 again and very much looking forward to this very timely series, which will touch on topics like trade and tariffs, as well as energy policy and climate policy. These are all topics which played a role in the US election, which are playing a role as we watch the German election unfold, and also which are likely to dominate domestic politics in the year to come. We're kicking off the series with an extremely important topic, namely a discussion about immigration. And there are a few topics which demand as much attention as immigration at the moment. This is true as we watch the political debate in Germany, as we reflect on the election campaigns here in the US and think about or anticipate what kind of policies might be introduced after the inauguration of Donald Trump next week. And as you'll hear from our two experts, are not new topics. This is not a new issue, but this is something that has been worthy of discussion for a while. We're joined by Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist and author Molly O'Toole. Her book, The Root, which focuses on global migration, will be published later this year. Molly, thank you very much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
And also with us is Victoria Rietig. She is the head of the Center for Migration at the German Council on Foreign Relations and has over 20 years of experience working on migration issues at think tanks on both sides of the Atlantic. Liebe Victoria, herzlich willkommen.
Thank you so much, Steve. I'm really glad to be with you.
So we're really delighted to have both of you with us. For our viewers, you can see more details about our speakers' bios in the chat. And before we get started, I just want to remind our viewers that both the ACG and 1014 are nonpartisan organizations. So the views expressed in this conversation are those of our two experts. And if you'd like to ask a question, please use the Q&A function in Zoom. Also, let us know who your question is directed to, and we will do our best to fold your questions into the conversation.
Well, so I was just about to talk a little bit about the differences in the United States and Germany, with the United States being a country of immigrants, whereas Germany just slowly in the last century started to allow immigration. In both countries, migration plays a pivotal role in the political debates. It's certainly one of the issues that polarizes our societies. So let's start with why migration is such a hotly debated topic. Crisis, and so how does this crisis look like? Are there similarities? Are there differences between the two countries? And maybe Victoria, let's start with you. So you published a book in 2016, the Willkommenskultur, and then moving beyond the crisis, Germany's new approach of integrating immigrants into the labor market, actually specifically. And in the fall, you had a lot of interviews on television about the migration summit, which was, of course, trying to troubleshoot the situation, get control of it. So can you please elaborate a little bit of what's going on in Germany? Is there a crisis? What's your take on that?
Yeah. Okay. Thank you so much for the question. So first off, to be really clear, no, we do not have a migration crisis in Germany right now. Certainly not a crisis as it relates to numbers. It's not a crisis of numbers. It's a crisis of confidence. And it's a bit of a crisis that is systemic, so of the actual migration system that we have built. And I really want to differentiate between the two. We don't have a crisis of numbers simply because the numbers have been falling quite consistently over the last year. Just to give you kind of a broad idea. The asylum numbers have fallen by about 100,000 this year or in 2024 compared to 2023. So in 2024, about 250,000 people, so pretty much exactly 250,000 asylum claims were lodged in Germany, which is a lot less than the year before. And at the same time, that falling in asylum numbers also has a direct impact on the communities. We know from surveys of German communities that they have fewer problems actually housing people and welcoming those people. And at the same time, we know that deportation numbers have actually risen. So not quite as steep. They've risen by about 20% in 2024 compared to 2023. So that was reason why this week the government actually pointed to these numbers, saying we have put measures in place and things are changing in our country, and we're trying our best here, and we can see that in the numbers. But despite the government saying that, of course, there is this crisis of confidence. There is this feeling that a lot of people say, well, okay, perhaps numbers have dipped a little bit now, or perhaps you've deported a few more people than before, but still overall, our country feels overwhelmed. Our communities are having trouble. Integration problems are coming up. So we don't have enough places in our schools. We don't have enough places in our daycare system. And we really think that the government, has failed in addressing all these issues that have been very urgent to us and that are urgent to us as a country. So there's a great sense of frustration, and that is why now in this very shortened electoral campaign, you see that in the surveys, you see that 6 out of 10 Germans at this point want to vote for parties that very clearly in their programs state that they want to have a substantive shift in the migration debate in Germany and in the migration policies. So you have about a third of the people saying they're going to vote for the CDU. Then you have an additional 20% saying they want to vote for the far-right populist AfD. And then you have about 5% each voting for the FDP, so the kind of economic liberal party, and the newly founded BSW, so which is a far left but anti-migrant party. And if you take all of those together, essentially you get over 60% of the voters that really want to have a real shift and a real departure from the migration policies we've seen in the past. You also asked the question about what are similarities and differences, but in the interest of keeping this more of a conversation and less of a monologue, I'm just going to put a full stop here. I look forward to what Molly has to say, and perhaps then we can come to the other question of like what are similarities and differences.
Yeah, thank you very much. So it's really interesting. On the one side, you say the numbers are not critical, but on the other side, you give us the image that the majority of voters want to have a shift in the policy. So maybe we can, try and elaborate a little bit or go a little bit deeper on that seemingly, gap between perception and reality later on. But Molly, yes, let's hop to you and see what's going on in the United States. So migration certainly was one of the hot topics in the election campaign, probably determined the outcome of the election quite a bit. Do you think, is there a crisis on the southern border? Is there a crisis overall? What is your perception of what's going on in the United States?
Well, I really like how Victoria described it as a crisis of confidence. I mean, to some degree, this is also what's going on in the United States. I have a friend, Dara Lind, who's an excellent policy analyst when it comes to immigration, and she sort of jokingly says it's about the vibes. It's more about the feelings. So there's often quite a large gap between the rhetoric and the reality, and we find that in the United States as well. So I would actually call it the term crisis has been used so often. There's basically been a crisis at the U.S. southern border for the last 30 or 40 years. If everything is a crisis, then nothing is a crisis, and especially in the context of the presidential campaign, the run-up to the 2024 presidential campaign, and during the Biden administration from 2020 onward, crisis is sort of used as a political gotcha. Well, they won't call it a crisis. They're denying that there's a crisis and trying to put people on the spot, and the term almost ceases to have meaning. What I would say is that there's an identity crisis in the United States, in addition to this crisis of confidence. And I would call it a humanitarian crisis rather than a migration crisis. And part of what's difficult about that terminology is to some extent, the US response to what is unprecedented migration to the United States, particularly over land through the Americas. The response is somewhat self-imposed in terms of the crisis, and I'll go into that a little bit. We have seen quite significant numbers, and the reason I describe it as unprecedented is not just because of these levels of migration. So it's since 2021, for example, it's about 8 million encounters, which does not necessarily represent individuals, but represents an encounter of a person. And I say that because there are repeat crossers. But there's been about 8 million encounters since 2021 at the US southern border, and that is quite significant. I do want to point out that consistently for the United States in the 80s and the 90s, all the way into the sort of early 2000s until the Great Recession, there was fairly consistently a million, close to 2 million encounters at the border, especially in the 80s and the 90s. But I do think to some extent, Americans grew accustomed to lower levels of migration at the US southern border, which probably had more to do with the Great Recession than it did and the economic downturn in the United States and globally than it did with any one particular US policy. The other way in which this migration is unprecedented, and I think this contributes a lot to the humanitarian, what I refer to as a humanitarian crisis rather than a migration crisis, because I believe that these are numbers that can be managed should they want to be managed. Is the demographic profile in who is coming to the United States. And this has been the focus of my work a lot over the last few years, in part due to increased restrictions, narrowing legal pathways in Europe, and increased restrictions and narrowing pathways in the United States, particularly targeting asylum since it's triggered by this sort of territorial presence. In part due to that, this migration route has opened up through the Western Hemisphere, in part due to a contrast with relatively liberal immigration policies throughout Latin America. What that has meant is that more people from around the world are using this migration route and arriving at the US-Mexico border. People from Asia, people from Africa, certainly from other parts of Latin America, Venezuela, for example. And this creates the dynamic of a humanitarian crisis for a number of reasons. Some of them are making what is the world's longest human migration. They are suffering from both in their origin country, in their transit country, and at times in the destination country. They're suffering from, they might be fleeing conflict, climate change, corruption, and they're suffering untold numbers of risks and abuse, including from authorities who are supposed to be enforcing immigration law and immigration protections all along the way. But these particular populations, the new people who are arriving in the United States, we've got more women, more children, more families than ever, people from around the world. The US immigration system is outdated, and I would argue the international regime, when it comes to refugee law, is outdated to deal with a sort of new profile of migrant who's coming to the United States. The United States often doesn't have agreements with their home countries in order to take people back. They're much more difficult to remove. They are seeking asylum, and the United States has consistently put resources toward the parts of the outdated and broken immigration system that can't adequately deal with these changes. And so what that does create is a humanitarian crisis, both in terms of what is suffered by these people along the way, and also the situation for them once they arrive. And this misallocation of resources and this sort of denial about this substantial shift in who is coming to the US-Mexico border, how they're coming, why they're coming, and how many are coming, has resulted in a real gap in services. And in that gap can be the appearance of a crisis, and that can be exploited by politicians who are sort of appealing to these base instincts. So to wrap up, what I mean by an identity crisis is the United States has often, the sort of national narrative we tell about ourselves is that we are a nation of immigrants, while at the and that we very much need immigrants for our country in order to function, particularly from a labor perspective, while at the same time saying, well, these immigrants are okay, but these immigrants are not okay, and increasingly, as a global leader, sort of leading this race to the bottom in terms of trying to evade legal, our obligations from a legal perspective when it comes to refugees.
One of our viewers has written a question to you, Molly, that they are curious if anyone has tried to quantify the impact of the results of the US election in 2024 on migration patterns, which are expected in 2025 and beyond?
I think it's far too soon for that. Certainly, what we have seen is, despite these quite high numbers that we're seeing during the Biden administration, particularly in the last 6 months or so of the Biden administration, those numbers had dropped precipitously, to where numbers were as low as they had been seen in 2020, the pandemic year, which was really an aberration in terms of, global borders being closed, and migration numbers being quite low. So there was a downward trend that was already occurring. What's interesting is actually in 2016, before Trump took office the first time, there was a sort of spike, a sort of rush. It was partially due to what smugglers were telling people. It was very much due to people listening to Trump himself, and the promises he was making from the campaign trail. It was sort of this idea of, we need to get in now before the doors close forever.
Mm-hmm.
And Canada, for example, was actually preparing for a rush from the United States into Canada, and similarly for there to be a kind of rush from south of the border, of people trying to get in before Trump took office again. We actually haven't seen that materialize. And it did materialize to some extent in 2016. And I was actually in southern Mexico at that time, seeing people from all over the world who were basically trying to make it in before Inauguration Day, just a few weeks after the election. We haven't seen that materialize. I think one data point that's sort of interesting to compare it to is 2017. There was this sort of rush. 2017 itself was quite a low year if we measure migration levels to the United States by apprehensions at the southern border, which is the number we tend to use. 2017 was quite a low year, but there was a very interesting thing that was said by John Kelly, who was Trump's first Homeland Security Secretary and then his chief of staff. They have a very difficult relationship now, to say the least. But he said, don't measure they were sort of trumpeting these low migration numbers and saying this sort of fear factor potentially is what may have kept migration quite low in Trump's first year. And he said, don't go by the numbers, because the numbers inevitably are going to change. The numbers inevitably are going to go up. And we actually did see quite a steady increase to where 2019, and this is after family separation, many of these very infamous policies the Trump administration put into place, 2019 was quite a high year. And I believe that's a trend that would have continued and been more in line with what we've seen the last couple of years, for a number of factors that do not have to do necessarily with US policy, global migration factors. But then the pandemic occurred in 2020. So we saw a low again. All a long-winded way of saying, I think it's too early to tell how Trump's election may have impacted migration flows so far, but it was on a downward trend. And if 2017 is a good comparison point, we might see quite low as a sort of wait and see period happens early on in Trump's administration. But I personally believe that there are larger global factors at play that mean the Trump administration is also going to face intense challenges with migration at the US southern border in the same way that the Biden administration did.
Thank you for that. Let me bring Victoria back into the conversation and sort of circle back to Katya's start, and something that you alluded to, of looking at some of the similarities and differences. Victoria, you set the stage for us very nicely about the situation in Germany and some of the systemic issues that exist. Obviously, we heard from Molly a little bit about the migration route that many people are taking. It doesn't necessarily take them through Germany or through Europe, although for some people it does. And we actually have a viewer question asking whether people perhaps migrate to Germany, even though that's a good place to end up for the job opportunities, for the education and whatnot, but whether or not some people use that as a stepping stone to the US. I'd be interested in sort of hearing some of your takeaways from what Molly said, and trying to tease out some of the parallels where you see similar challenges in Germany to the ones that Molly shared with us as well.
Yeah, happy to address that. So if I understand the question correctly, it's, do people go to Germany kind of as a step and then from there to the US?
Yes.
That I don't really have seen evidence of. I think what rather occurs is that people think very carefully about where they actually want to go, where they have the best chances of either arriving and then once there thriving. So usually the decision is very closely linked with what's the economic situation in the country. Are you in an upturn or a downturn? Are there jobs available there? And the other question is, do you have family or friends? Because so diaspora and jobs is kind of the two main predictors of people choosing destination countries. So if you are in Germany already, where right now we have a large demand of labor, where it is very easy to enter the labor market, and you have very generous social benefits, and you have large diasporas of the main countries of origin of asylum seekers in Germany, that's Syria, Afghanistan, Turkey, Iraq, and Iran. So you have basically everything set up for more people to come. And once you are there, then it would be quite unlikely that then you go and make your way to the US. I think what rather happens is that that decision actually precedes it. So one nationality, for instance, that has seen a spike at the US border in recent years has been Turks. And that is perhaps in part because Germany actually has very low recognition rates of Turks who are applying for asylum. So if you are a Turkish citizen and you are a little bit informed and can use your internet and ask your Turkish friends in the US and your Turkish friends in Germany, you will ask, where do I have better chances? And increasingly, because the US has actually given protection, it was much more likely to receive that protection in the US. The US has become a more attractive destination. And then because the route actually has developed where through Latin America people can go, you've seen that spike in Turkish citizens. And I do believe also in Russian and Chinese citizens that actually make it through the Darien Gap. So in that sense, it is related, but not as a stepping stone, but rather as an either or destination. So I hope that addressed that question. Then I just wanted to say one thing on Molly's very correct summary of it's too early to tell what the impact is going to be on the migration patterns to the US in 2025. But I think for me, the main factor that I would watch if you're interested in knowing what happens at the US border is actually Mexico, and whether Mexico is going to continue its policy of decompression at the border, which has been in place, to my knowledge, since January of 24, so about a year, where basically they've agreed to put migrants onto buses in northern Mexico and then just bus them to southern Mexico. So importantly, not deport them further down, which of course they've done in the past quite a lot and are still doing to a large degree, but literally just bring them a very far way away from the border so that then they get off and kind of make their way up again. It is this situation of decompression at the border that I believe was done by Mexico partly to ensure that there wasn't going to be another Trump presidency. The big question is that going to be continued or not? What are the levers that the US is going to use towards Mexico? How is Claudia Sheinbaum going to react to that? So I really can encourage everyone, just look at what the neighbors are doing, because oftentimes that is the more important factor in the arrival numbers than what you are doing yourself. So that was that. And now to your actual question, I'll try and be a little bit brief there. On the similarities and differences. So migration today in Germany and the US really is more similar than at any other point in our country's history, okay? We are very much struggling with the same problems. We're struggling with the large number of arrivals that seek humanitarian protection or just a better life. Both of our asylum systems are absolutely outdated and they are very much backlogged. They take too long and they're not very good at actually sifting through the mass of people and separating out those that need protection and those that don't. So this individualized checking of claims just is actually a little bit anachronistic in the situation. It's very hard to do and very labor intensive. Both of our countries have great trouble returning people that don't receive protection back to their home countries. And that's a problem that Germany has had for the longest time, and the US is slowly catching up. Why was that never a problem for the US until now? Well, because until very recently, flows simply weren't that mixed. So it was extremely easy to return people and deport them back to Central America. I myself did research in Central America, and I've seen, in El Salvador and Guatemala and Honduras, where people get off the planes, and that entire system was kind of put in place. But now that the demography has changed so much, now that you have all the Venezuelans there, you have people there from Cuba, from Haiti, basically from countries where simply the diplomatic relationships are in a way that these countries can actually say, nope, we are going to make this very hard for you. The US simply doesn't have the levers it needs towards these countries. And that's exactly Germany's experience and Europe's experience for the longest time, because we simply didn't have the levers towards a lot of the countries that matter for us when it comes to deportations. Both of our countries are also increasingly, obviously, focusing on border controls. And Molly, I think you said it's kind of resources have been poured, I think you said, into kind of the wrong parts of the system, kind of to deal with the challenge.
Exactly.
I also say that quite often, that in a way we have a flat tire in our migration system, but we keep fixing the wrong tire. You know, we keep investing in kind of the border management systems, which are legitimate, of course. It's legitimate to invest in them. But you need to balance it out with all the systems kind of before it, the prevention, the diplomatic relations with countries, and with all the systems afterwards, the asylum system, the integration systems, et cetera, et cetera. And so that isn't happening in both our countries. And as a result of that, the debate in our country has become a lot more toxic, and the demands have become more extreme. Last thing I want to say is that the demands on both sides of the political spectrum have become more extreme, both on the right and on the left. And that is true, again, in Germany and the US. You have these calls on the left to abolish ICE. You have calls to abolish Frontex here in Germany and Europe. And on the right, you have the calls to mass deport or for remigration, as, for instance, the populist AfD is calling for it. And finding pragmatic, middle-of-the-road solutions, like actual policy solutions, has become extremely difficult, because no politician ever wants to actually touch that subject unless they have to. And then when they touch it, you can't gain voters by making middle-of-the-road structural change suggestions. That's simply not attractive. It is much more attractive to go for the extremes, because it actually ensures you voters. Now, I know I've been too long already, but so that was all the similarities. I just want to point out one key difference, and that is really crucial to our countries and how we deal with this. While the mess we have, the migration mess we have, is very similar, the mess manifests itself very differently in our countries, because the German political system is so much more focused on compromise through the coalitions you need. So, for instance, the hardcore demands on the right that we're seeing right now in Germany by the Union, by the AfD, et cetera, they are not going to be actually implemented unfiltered, because they need coalition partners that then are going to kind of water down these solutions to something that is a little more middle of the road. While there are positive sides to that, to this kind of art of compromise, the downside really is that we often have very watered down solutions that fail to change the problems. So there are all these structural flaws in the German migration system that aren't being addressed. And when the government actually says we are going to do X, oftentimes the implementation is neither effective nor efficient. And in the US, it actually is. In the US, when the president decides something and puts his 600 executive orders in place, as has been done in the last legislation, things actually noticeably, measurably change. And people see that. And the population sees something is being done. In Germany, that is the feeling that is missing. Nothing is being done. That's the perception, because it rarely trickles down from the federal level to the state and local level, where the implementation is vastly different, incredibly unfair. And so in that sense, I would say that is a huge difference in our countries that has some upsides. Again, we don't have a Trump, and we're not going to have an AfD, but it also really has downsides, because the potential for real change is just too small.
I think that, this is super interesting, because I think a lot of what you just said also ties very much in with the identity issues that both of you raised in your opening comments, right? The perception issue, how does this play out in the public? But also, as you both discussed, the systemic issues and now even the structural flaws that exist in each of the two systems and how comparable they are. Molly, I wanted to give you a chance to sort of respond to what we heard from Victoria, because I'm sure that there are some things that resonated with you. Not necessarily things that you see radically differently, but there might be some things that you want to pick up there. But I also wanted to ask you, because I'm fascinated by this, how you see Mexico's decompression policy unfolding, because I think that was one of the interesting points that Victoria made. And then I'll let Katja take over and take us in a slightly different direction with the conversation.
There are so many things to pick up on from the excellent points that Victoria made, but I'm so glad you brought up Mexico, because Mexico is actually the single most important country to the United States. I would argue that that relationship is actually the most important relationship that the United States has, but especially from a migration context. So it should have been part of my answer to the first question about, is anyone sort of tracking what the potential election of Trump, how that has impacted migration flows. There was a lot of sort of criticism. It was sort of like no matter what the Biden administration did on immigration, they sort of didn't get the political credit. And I do think their main priority and a lot of the motivation for the actions that they took in trying to reduce these numbers at the border was politically motivated. It was to try and have a different outcome in the 2024 presidential election. Same on the other hand, from critics of the Biden administration, I think a lot of their inaction on things that maybe could have been done to help at the border were done because they wanted to win the election and they wanted to run on this issue. And so it wasn't in their interest to attempt to fix it because they wanted to sort of hang it around the neck of the Biden administration. So the Biden administration actually in many ways went further than the Trump administration even was able to do on some of these issues, in particular when it comes to restricting access to asylum, which has been the probably most significant contributor to numbers at the border, to immigration in the United States, particularly in the last several years. So what you have are people presenting themselves at the US-Mexico border, whether at a port of entry or between it. And I should note that ports of entry have primarily been closed since 2019, so they've been left with no choice if they wish to access asylum, but to cross between a port of entry, turning themselves in, presenting themselves for asylum. But where I'm going with this is there was a lot of criticism that the Biden administration, well, it was too little, too late, especially with one of the more recent actions they took, which was to close the border. You can't actually close the US-Mexico border, it's 2,000 miles long. But until a certain threshold was below a certain threshold of apprehensions, basically no asylum for anyone until we reach that number. There was a lot of criticism that was too little, too late. But what people missed is that actually not only had the Biden administration gone much further than the Trump administration in restricting access to asylum and taken many steps before, but they sort of weren't well publicized or understood. And they didn't get credit for them, but also the role of Mexico. So on the one hand, they were criticized for doing too little, too late, but also didn't really get any credit for this reduction in numbers that happened, particularly in the last 6 months of the administration. And a part of the reason they didn't get credit for that is not the sort of nuanced understanding that the American voter had. I think part of it's due to the fact that it was actually less about US policy and more about what Mexico is doing. So Mexico's role in and as you said, Mexico, it's not a significant number of deportations that Mexico has taken on, although in past years, Mexico has removed more people than the United States has. It's this sort of game of simply giving the appearance of reducing numbers at the border. But these people don't disappear once they go on the other side of the US-Mexico border. And it's sort of just this moving around of people, waving your hands, with Mexico pushing them towards the south, and in some cases, doing removals to Guatemala. This is a pattern that Mexico has repeated. Pressure rises in Mexico in terms of the numbers. Mexico tries to hold on behalf of the United States. That pressure breaks. People arrive to the border. The pattern gets repeated. And I think we'll see it be repeated again with Claudia Sheinbaum and the Trump administration. And it's really a statement on the limits of US policy, how much they rely on their partners, and this sort of globalization of migration that we're seeing. Panama, for example, is also a really crucial country that recently started doing US-funded deportations from Panama, for example. It's this outsourcing of immigration enforcement. And I think that's a pattern that we're seeing in the United States as well as in Europe, an outsourcing of asylum processing, an offshoring of asylum, and an outsourcing of immigration and enforcement. A few really quick things that I wanted to pick up on, though. When the United States defines its relationship with countries in Latin America and elsewhere entirely by migration, what that does is it actually gives those countries a lot of leverage to sort of turn off the spigot, turn on the spigot, turn off the spigot, turn on the spigot. It makes the United States very vulnerable to human beings being used as leverage. And I think we could draw some parallels, for example, with Turkey and Europe. other countries, transit countries or origin countries that are really quite crucial to the flow of migration to Europe or to the United States. It's giving them quite a lot of power. And I think that if you define by that single issue, there's a vulnerability there. So I think Mexico actually has much more leverage than the United States, and particularly the Trump administration gives them credit for. Really, really quickly, as Victoria said, this is entirely correct. The U.S. immigration system is still designed for a sort of 80s, 90s era mindset of single adult Mexican males crossing the border who can be easily removed. And that has not been the case, for at least 20 years. It was interesting, Victoria's note on the sort of system of government within Germany and how that intersects with this issue. Particularly because Congress has not passed what could be considered comprehensive immigration reform for the better part of 30, 40 years. There's been inaction in Congress on this issue. The executive not only does the executive have a lot of power when it comes to immigration, national security, and foreign policy, but it has absorbed quite a lot of power with this abdication of responsibility because Congress is completely gridlocked and hasn't done much of anything, much less on immigration. So I think that while rightly the executive is quite powerful on immigration, and we saw 600 executive actions on immigration under Biden, 400 some executive actions on immigration under Trump. While that is true, Congress still controls the purse strings. So for example, because of this misallocation of resources within the immigration system, I promise I'm wrapping up, part of the argument for why people believe that asylum is being abused or taken advantage of with, the overwhelming majority of people arriving at the border, then seeking asylum, and they're often allowed to stay in the United States for a number of years. That's in part because the system is so backlogged. So we have I think it's around 3.8 million cases pending in the immigration courts. And this backlog has just ballooned under every administration, Republican and Democrat. And I think it's almost 1.8 million that are just specifically immigrants awaiting asylum hearings. So that often means that someone can stay in the United States for years, earn money, send money back home. They might have US citizen children. They become quite well established. Some people argue that's a draw. That's part of the one of the main pull factors and why people are using the asylum system in this way. And yet the immigration court system, the asylum corps, the asylum officers are the only ones who can adjudicate asylum, not Border Patrol, for example, has received almost no money. Resources are not directed toward the part of the system that could actually address this backlog, can adjudicate asylum claims at all. Instead, it's directed toward a wall structure, which doesn't work when you have people not trying to evade Border Patrol, but rather turn themselves in.
Right.
And so it's just an example of how these resources are not very well allocated. And so Congress's abdication of its role, despite being the one that controls the purse strings, still has quite a negative impact on actually addressing the modern profile of migration to the US-Mexico border, despite the fact that the executive does have quite a lot of power in this area.
Thank you so much. There's just so much now we can talk about, but I would just like to hone in on illegal immigration, because I do think, there is probably a consent in society that we should keep doors open for asylum seekers, refugees, people in dire need, where we have a legal obligation according to international treaties. It's just a matter of how do we organize this. Well, you just explained how the system seems to be broken, resources are not well allocated. So also that, of course, stirs a bad sentiment in societies about all these people staying here and they're not doing anything, and they're a drain on our resources and all of that, because stuff is not processed right. So illegal immigration, and what do we do with undocumented immigrants in society? That seems to us, or to me, as this is what really gets people upset. And when you see in the United States, one of President-elect Trump's first executive orders will maybe be authorization for mass transportation. I'm just curious, from given what you have explained already, what is your take specifically on how do we handle undocumented immigrants in our various countries? I know it's a huge problem in the US. Would be curious to hear how it is in Germany and what the take on it is. And also maybe you can elaborate a little bit of, put some facts to the discussion. So what actually are the numbers? What kind of status do they have? I know DACA is one of the controversial programs here in the United States, but do undocumented immigrants receive any benefits, health care? Do they have obligations? Do they pay taxes? What is actually, what do we talk about when we talk about illegal immigration? And I don't know, whoever wants to start. Victoria, maybe you, okay, Molly, go ahead.
I think Victoria should, because I just rambled for a long time on that last one. If you don't mind, Victoria, I think you should start.
No worries. Yeah, I'm happy to start. So on Germany, some numbers on the undocumented. So we've actually had a large shift happening in the last legislative period of 4 years, where we've seen for the first time in a long time an actual big drop in the number of the unauthorized, or Ausreisepflichtige, as we call them, in Germany. From about 300,000, so it kind of steadily crept up for about a decade or more than a decade, and then it actually fell from 300,000 to about 240,000, so just under 250,000, which of course is teensy compared with kind of US numbers. But again, remember, we're also a smaller country. So it has dropped. Why has that dropped so much? Because the government that is currently in power, so the outgoing government of the SPD, the Greens, and the FDP, they said, okay, we have a lot of unauthorized, and we know that we can't all deport them because our deportation system is not working well. So let's instead come up with kind of a two-pronged approach where we're going to try to, sure, deport, that's part of it, but also to create some regularization and kind of pathways into a legal status. They passed a law called the Chanceneinwanderungsgesetz, or the Opportunities for Legal Status law, where people that had been in the country in a deferred deportation status, in German Duldung, were allowed to apply for a temporary legal status if they fulfilled certain criteria, such as, their identity being clear and, having some kind of being in education or in labor. And then they got that temporary status for 18 months. And if by the end of it, they had fulfilled some more conditions, they could actually move into a permanent or a more permanent legal status. And because of that, we've had this large drop in the numbers of the unauthorized. But what actually has not decreased at all in that time is the number of those people that have received a no to their asylum claim, and where they haven't received the deferred deportation, but just actually are deportable and should be deported, but aren't deported. That number very consistently is somewhere between 50 and 55,000 in Germany. Yeah, so that on kind of the undocumented. You asked, well, do these people get benefits? Yes, they do. And that is where a lot of the German hot debate is focused on, the fact that people receive quite a lot of benefits compared to other countries. And people even receive benefits if they have gotten a rejected asylum claim and they still remain in the country, even though they are deportable. So that is really what rubs a lot of people in Germany the wrong way. And why we have a large debate about actually cutting the benefits to rejected asylum seekers, to the people that are ausreisepflichtig, so kind of the unauthorized. I'll stop there. Did I answer your question though? Because I gave a few numbers and then I kind of I tried to give like the big picture, but if I don't answer it, please feel free to poke me.
No, absolutely. And I think it's really interesting, the one fact that you said the numbers have dropped of undocumented immigrants in Germany because there has been actually a pathway to a legal status, right? So I'm just curious, Molly.
But no one's celebrating that, right? I should really point that out. I think that not many Germans know that, for the simple fact that the government does their utmost not to talk about that, because for fear of then being told, well, you opened not the borders, but you opened the systems to those people that on principle should have been deported. And of course, a pragmatic approach is to, have this two-pronged approach. But it is just a sign that one of the greatest successes of this last, just kind of in terms of migration, like commonsensical migration policy that has happened in other countries as well, which is, some form of legalization for some groups. So it is just a testament to where our migration debate is, that the government is very worried and does not talk about that.
Yeah, wow, very interesting. So you have two-pronged approach with a focus on the first prong and the second one actually also, contributing to bringing the numbers down. In the US, of course, there have been different programs of, providing a pathway to legal status in the past. And this is, of course, one of the highly controversial topics in society. Also, people from migration backgrounds, Latinos especially, it seems like this group is also specifically sensitive about illegal immigration and opening pathways to citizenship because they have gone through all these troubles sort of to immigrate legally. So how do we get a consensus in society about, and then which policies? So where do you think, Molly, we're heading to, and what might be the right way to deal with this topic? And then, of course, before I hand over to Steve for the finishing question, what about the mass deportations? Do we have to brace ourselves
Right.
for what to come?
Well, there's so much to touch on there, and I'll try and do it in an efficient way. But especially with Victoria said, in terms of what could be sort of more positive immigration stories, or no one is really making the proactive case for immigration, or even daring to sort of point out when there might be potentially positive things. And I think that's in part because of where our current public discourse is when it comes to immigration. And I think that is the way in which the Trump administration and his allies, especially Stephen Miller, for example, domestic policy advisor, who will have a more prominent role in the White House now, have been the most successful. Because to some extent in the United States, there has been broad-based public support for legal immigration, while there has been less and often very critical of illegal immigration. So this sort of dichotomy of, well, economic migrant, bad, refugee, good. And this has sort of been how the debate has been in the past. Now, with Trump sort of upending everything, and sort of Trumpism upending everything in the US political system, that entire debate about immigration has shifted rightward to the extent to which it is now all immigration bad. Even legal immigration. And I really should emphasize, asylum is legal immigration. It is in US immigration law, and along with our international obligations, that however you arrive at the US-Mexico border, whether you cross at a port of entry, which by the way you can't because they're closed, or you cross between a port of entry, which would be considered an unauthorized entry, an illegal crossing, they are turning themselves in to claim asylum, which is legal immigration. The people who have been allowed into the United States in significant numbers, especially over the past several years, they were permitted to enter the United States. They were paroled into the United States by the US government. The US government knows where they are. Many of them have been given court hearings, or they've been given appointments at ICE offices. So asylum is legal immigration. You do not hear the Biden administration talking about that. And I think that's in part because of where the debate is. So I just really want to emphasize that the overwhelming number of people who have come to the United States over the past several years, legal immigration, asylum is legal immigration. But no one makes that distinction. I think it's worth noting, for example, the really honestly, xenophobic, racist trope that emerged and just lie in the course of the 2024 campaign about Haitians in Ohio, eating their pets. It was a lie. It was absolutely a lie. And when confronted with the fact that it was a lie, the incoming vice president essentially said, well, it doesn't matter so long as it gets media attention. And so long as it gets attention, doesn't matter that it's a lie. He knew that it was a lie, repeating this. But also that when people pointed out that these Haitians had legal permission, they had work permits, they had legal status in the United States, he basically said, well, that doesn't count. It's illegal immigration in my eyes. And that's sort of where the debate has settled in the United States. Now, there is a significant undocumented population in the United States. What's interesting is that it actually sort of ticked down to what they believe to around 10 million undocumented people in the United States. is around 11 million now, whereas the United States has reached what's the highest proportion of foreign-born since the period that we tend to associate with immigration in the United States in the 1800s, sort of this Ellis Island period, when in fact there were many Germans coming to the United States, among other groups from Europe. But the undocumented population has only ticked up slightly. And I think that's due in part to a reflection of the more recent arrivals have been sort of shunted into these different avenues of legal status, sometimes asylum, but often these temporary categories, a kind of twilight status that usually has some kind of termination date, but does not offer a path to citizenship. And that's what's different about asylum, is that it can be translated ultimately into a path to citizenship. This most significant contributions to the undocumented population in the United States were not this mass wave of people coming over the US-Mexico border. It was the border itself being hardened so that people could no longer go back and forth. So all of a sudden you have a dramatic increase in people who are staying in the United States rather than returning to Mexico, for example. And that has been the most significant increase to the undocumented population in the United States. The most significant decrease was the Great Recession, when you started having more people go back to Mexico than come to the United States. Undocumented people in the United States pay taxes. They have access to some social services, especially depending on which state they're in, such as healthcare, but generally don't have significant access to social services. I think this is also a key difference potentially between Germany and the United States. Asylum seekers, actually, in fact, this is not well understood, as opposed to a refugee who's resettled through a formal process from abroad. And they have access to housing, usually, sometimes vocational, sometimes language training, a certain amount of support for a certain period of time. Asylum seekers do not. They have to wait 180 days to get a work permit, for example, and it often takes far longer than that. So while they do have legal status, they don't often have access to social services, or their access is limited unless it's being provided on a local or state level. And I will end my, deportations. And then I will end my answer. I'm sorry, I've been very, very rambling. I think that deportations require money. Deportations require quite a lot of money. Removals do, especially when we're talking about people coming from farther away, talking about people who come from countries with whom the United States may not have diplomatic relations or a good diplomatic relationship. They require the cooperation of other countries. They're not unilateral. They're very expensive. In the past, DHS has said that the sort of maximum amount of deportations that they can do based on their resources and the infrastructure in place is around 400,000. And that was the level of removals that the Biden administration achieved last year, which is more deportations than the Trump administration actually undertook. So they require quite a lot of money. The system and the budget is not in place to do the kind of deportations that the Trump administration has promised in the millions of people. I actually don't think the American public would be willing to tolerate how much that would cost, much less the sort of impact on communities and impact on the US economy. So I think a lot of this is scare tactics, even if the Trump administration was able to mobilize local law enforcement, all of DHS, was able to get states to go along with it, was able to get the planes that has the detention space. If all of these things were in place, if they were able to either just evade waiting for a lawsuit or change laws in order to give them more resources to do this, even still, we're probably talking about the hundreds of thousands to 1 million people. Now, I'm not trying to minimize that impact, especially from a human cost and a community cost. But I think a lot of this, these are sort of scare tactics. I think we will see in the first several days a kind of shock and awe, probably mass immigration raids, maybe potentially even in Washington, D.C. or in democratic cities, this sort of idea of trolling, democratic critics using human beings. But immigration raids themselves don't actually tend to net a lot of people. They can have a great impact. So I think a lot of this is more scare tactics and sort of shock and awe. They cannot achieve what they have promised to achieve, but we'll see if their Trump supporters or the American public actually hold them accountable for what they are not able to achieve.
Thank you. It is amazing to me how quickly this hour has passed, and we clearly could have gone on for much longer. So we will have to have you back, but our time is running out. So let me sort of maybe come back to kind of that starting point where both of you brought up identity as one of the issues. Obviously, in the chat and the Q&A, issues around xenophobia have also been coming up a little bit. That's been something that's been raised by both of you. But I'd like to come back to the sort of identity question. And Victoria, let me start with you. I mean, one of the things that I was reading, in preparation for today's conversation was that more than a quarter of people in Germany have some sort of a immigration or migration history or story, with children under the age of 14. It's even a third of the population. And so do you think that Germany is sort of on track to become a Migrationsland, right? Or a immigration country, despite some of the challenges that you were talking about that make that incredibly difficult? I mean, when does this become salonfähig, right? When does it become acceptable to talk about Germany as a country that is made up of people who've also come from different places?
I don't want to rain on your parade, but I think that has been acceptable for a long time now.
Okay, good.
I think
Good.
I mean, this whole Germany is not a country of immigration. I think that belief really was kind of shattered in the early 2000s. And that has been clear even in the discourse of kind of the far right. It is clear that, Germany is a country of immigration. And we have been for the longest time. We had the dips with the two world wars. But if you look historically, kind of, at 100, 150 years, Germany as the biggest economy and kind of what was Germany even before we were Germany, we always had immigration there. So in that sense, I think that knowledge has really arrived in Germany. I just think that sometimes the knowledge about Germany and the fact that it is a country of immigration has been for its history really has not arrived in the US yet so far. So I really wanted to make that point. But one really important thing, and I'll end there because I know our time is short. The chance to meet a migrant is higher in Germany than it is in the US. And you really have to be aware of that. And that is a new phenomenon that has developed over the last 10 years. Why? Because of the large humanitarian flows we've had. So right now, just today, the new migration report by the government came out. It's annual. And we're that close to the magic level of 30% of people are either migrants or have at least one parent who's a migrant. So basically are either first or second generation migrants. That's 30%. In the US, the number, to my knowledge, is closer to and around 25%. Now, 10 years ago, Germany was exactly there with the US. So within a course of 10 years, we've moved from 25% to 30%. That is a huge jump, and that was mostly driven by humanitarian migration. And I do believe that it is that huge jump, actually, that contributed so much to this anti-migrant sentiment, because we know that anti-migrant sentiment does not grow where you have most migrants, but where the pace of change of migration is fastest. I do believe that migration, when well paced, can be a good thing for a country. But I think it hasn't been well paced, in fact, in both of our countries, because our system aren't broken. And let me end on one note of disagreement, because we've agreed a whole lot, which of course is nice, but maybe frustrating to some listeners. So Molly, you said so many good things. I will hone in on one sentence that I think was not wrong, but incomplete. You said, well, asylum is legal immigration. And that's of course correct. But the second part of the sentence is, but it is an unorderly entry. It is unplanned, it is spontaneous, it is not controlled in any way, even with the CBP1 app, And people want control, they want order, they want to have the feeling that their laws can actually be implemented by their government. When they lose that feeling, as they have in both our countries, that's when we are in trouble. So I would really caution us to just see that one side, it's, the numbers are rising, that must mean we are all becoming, more friendly towards this. No, rising numbers does not necessarily mean rising acceptance.
But that's where I think that your point about the pacing becomes so important, and it comes back again to the identity issues, the perception issues around xenophobia. If you can pace the migration and integration in a way that it is also more digestible for the society, that makes it more likely to be successful all around for everybody. If it happens too fast, or if it happens in a chaotic or unorderly way, that then creates huge difficulties. So Molly, let's sort of stay in that vein for just a minute, and that is, we have this sort of historical identity as a nature of immigrants, and that's something that I think most Americans would adhere to and take pride in, and yet we have these incredibly volatile political debates at the moment around restrictions to migration. How does one kind of reconcile these two things, the history and then what's playing out politically at the moment, or in the political debates?
I mean, I think a few of Victoria's points are really quite interesting to pick up on, and that do answer your question. I mean, interestingly, the foreign-born population in the United States, which is believed to have reached its highest level in the last several years, it really had peaked around the 1800s, I believe the 1850s, around 14% or a little bit higher, and had not returned to those levels until now, where it's believed to be closer to 15%, and that is all that increase or back to that level is believed to be due to the migration, the really incredible levels of migration seen in the last several years. Still only 15%. A lot of Americans don't know that. And in terms of foreign-born population, now, of course, many people are descended from immigrants or second-generation immigrants and so on. But that's a much lower number than people think. I've given talks where I've asked Americans what they believe that number to be, and they'll say 25, 30, 40, 50, 60. It's 15. And I think our rhetoric contributes a lot to this idea. To Victoria's point, I mean, the dichotomy was between legal immigration and illegal immigration, not between orderly and disorderly. There wasn't necessarily a commentary on that. I mean, this is the way the asylum law is written. That is the way it's written. Between a port of entry or at a port of entry, it doesn't make the distinction, and that is really key, because that means the United States is limited in terms of how much it can control. A lot of factors are outside of its control. It's very dependent on other countries. It says the right to seek asylum, not to win asylum. So I should also note that the approval rates for asylum actually came down under the Biden administration. I believe it's around 35%. So most people don't win their asylum cases, which is also important to note. But where I think this gets into this sort of story we tell ourselves about ourselves as being a nation of immigrants, and at the same time, there seeming to be this sort of turn against immigration. I think that there is a tendency to sort of pull the ladder up behind you. We've seen this throughout U.S. history, and I think other countries have followed a similar pattern. One generation of immigrants sort of turning their back on the next generation of immigrants, and so on and so forth.
And often even from the same place.
Exactly. And we've seen, for example, when there was waves of migration from China, that led to sort of the first quotas in the United States, race-based and nationality-based quotas, for example. So I think that's important to note, but at the same time, it also has a lot to do with this inaction by Congress to pass comprehensive immigration reform to really address the fact that the system is outdated. I mean, asylum law itself, refugee law, in the wake of World War II, I mean, the definition of a refugee was first stated in the legal definition in the 50s. I mean, we live in an entirely different world now. This is also on the international community, but in terms of the United States, what I'm trying to say here is that there's frustration among earlier generations of immigrants in the United States, in part because they see people coming and accessing the United States, accessing the quote unquote American dream, getting a legal status fairly quickly, because subsequent administrations have tried to address this sort of first in, first out principle. Tried to address this increase, whereas there has not been comprehensive immigration reform. There hasn't been really an address to the DGAP population, for example, which is hundreds of thousands of people, hundreds of thousands of more people having this sort of limbo status, this temporary status that's continually extended, but not access to citizenship or people who have been living in the shadows for decades, people who have been in line from countries like Mexico, China, India, for 20, 30, 40 years, or waiting to bring their family. They're frustrated. They're thinking, what about me? And that's in part because of this abdication, that there hasn't been legislation, comprehensive legislation, to deal with this issue, to update the immigration enforcement system itself, to direct resources to the parts of the system that can have the greatest impact, and then what to do with these long-standing populations that have either a temporary status or no status at all. I think that's part of the frustration that we're seeing, and in that frustration, politicians who seek power can take advantage of that. And so that's to some extent, I believe, what's going on in terms of the frustration of the people who are coming more recently. One last thing I want to say really quickly, I know we're over time. The really incredible economic recovery of the United States from COVID, it has been, by the Congressional Budget Office, by other nonpartisan agencies, is almost entirely due to this recent wave of migration. So at the same time that people reelected Donald Trump, in part due to some of these promises of even greater restrictions on immigration, both legal and illegal, this economic recovery of the United States, with almost record employment, cannot find enough people to do jobs, is due almost entirely to this very same immigration. So there may be frustration around inflation, high costs, housing shortages, but the sort of macroeconomic indicators of this really, really quite incredible recovery from this incredibly devastating global economic event, almost entirely due to that same immigration. So this tension between needing immigrants, not just in terms of our history and our historical connection and ethical and humanistic legal obligations, but needing immigrants while at the same time exploiting them, both politically and in terms of their labor. I think this tension is going to continue, especially as the United States, Europe, other regions of the world experience this sort of demographic cliff in terms of an aging population and needing workers.
And I'm glad that you brought that demographic piece in at the very end there, because I was going to say, particularly as we look at Germany and its demographic trends, right, the need for the labor force is incredibly important. I think my takeaway from the comments that both of you just made in closing here is it is more important than ever, both domestically in both countries, but also across the Atlantic, to have these kinds of conversations in the hope that more and more people will develop a deeper, more nuanced understanding about what's actually happening. And so since we've really just sort of skimmed the tip of the iceberg here without consulting with Katja, we would love to have the two of you back for another session to sort of continue the conversation and deepen the conversation. I think, as we all know, the challenges around migration and around immigration policy are not going to disappear anytime soon for either of the countries that we've been talking about. The issues that affect the people who are on the move are not going to disappear anytime soon. And so these are going to be topics that we're going to have to be grappling with, and where it's really important to figure out ways of getting around some of those systemic structural roadblocks and try to create a better path forward for all of us. But for now, let me just thank all of you for participating in this discussion. It's been a really great discussion, and I appreciate your taking the time to meet with us.
Thanks for having us. And next time, I promise to keep my responses to like 2 minutes only.
It's quite all
Thanks so
right.
much.
No apologies.
It's been such a pleasure.
Take care. Bye.